Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our series on intro syntax. Today, I am going to continue to talk about WH movements, also known as a bar movements. We're going to move actually a little bit away from questions today. We'll start by reviewing a little bit of what we did yesterday, but we're going to expand on what we talked about last time and do a little bit of basically intro semantics, and then use that to build sort of a basic grammatical model. And I'll use that to I'll place that grammatical model sort of in where we are in terms of like contemporary grammatical theory and so forth. I also want to make kind of an exciting announcement, a paper that I co-authored with Andrew Mackenzie on language change in interstellar travel. Just came out in the Acta Futura, which is a journal of the Advanced Concepts team of the European Space Agency. So I'm wearing a tie pin. This was actually owned, it's part of a collection that I have that belonged to a NASA engineer who passed away, and I inherited it. Well, I purchased it through a vintage collector, but I own the entire collection. And if I knew my NASA satellites better, I could tell you specifically which mission this was associated with, but I don't. I should figure that out. Anyway, I will post a link to the article in the description for this video if you're interested. So let's talk again about the basics of a bar movement. I got these new exciting markers. Ooh, double-sided should make it easier to do movement. So let's talk a little bit about the basics of WH movement. We will add in a little bit more of some of the restrictions today, use that to expand on our discussion, and add in a little bit of some discussion of semantics, build into that a discussion of our grammatical model, and then close for today. And then in our next video, we'll talk about some how we can use this to explore some cross-linguistic variation. So the basics, just to review, so we have a sentence like Selicum eats almonds. So that's a basic declarative, and then we want to take a sentence like does Selicum eat almonds? That's a yes/no question. And then from that we can build a WH question. What does Selicum eat? And we'll go through these in each step. So we'll start with the basic declarative. So we have a 0. And I'm going to use the lowering analysis for T, but again, you can use that selectional analysis, and it's going to get you it's going to get you the same results. And the selectional analysis is what's discussed in the Kearney textbook. Just given my sort of general distributive morphology view of the world, I tend to prefer the lowering analysis. So that's what I'm going to go with. I'm also working on my own textbook right now in the same series on morphology, and it's gonna heavily use lowering when I get to those sections. So for those reasons, I'm going to stick with lowering. But feel free to use whatever you would prefer. I've also written articles on lowering, or that use lowering. So this is a place that Andrew is a dear friend of mine. And he was a mentor and a professor of mine, and we fundamentally disagree on these points. And I tell him constantly, don't worry. I'll tell him later today. So we start off with our sentence here with the basic declarative. So we have DP almonds eats, and then so we have past. Oh wait, this was present minus past, and then EPP nom Celicum. Okay. So here is the sort of the base structure of the sentence. Hold this up for a second. I'll start off by showing the agreement relations, and then we'll do our basic movement operations. So the agreement relations that we have here, we're going to have, again, yeah, you can see this here. We're going to have eats giving accusative case and the theta role, the thematic theta role to almonds. It's also going to give an agent theta role to Celicum, but no case. This is not a case position. And I will warn you that we are going to modify this in some way, that this sort of VP relation, the agent relationship with the verb itself, is going to change in some way. But the kind of fundamental structural relation is more or less the same. We're just going to add a little bit more structure here. So for the basic declarative, Celicum is going to have to move. I'll mark that in a different color. So Celicum is going to raise. It's going to raise into this the specifier of T position. And here it is going to check both it's going to get the nominative case from the T, and it's going to check the EPP feature of T. And this is the basic declarative. So Celicum eats almonds. Now, to form a yes-no question, the basic changes are pretty straightforward. The Q feature of C is just a plus instead of minus. Oh, I did leave off one thing, which is the lowering. So T lowers to V in the basic declarative. So in our yes/no question, we're just going to deal with this by saying, okay, no. So we have to somehow satisfy this Q feature, and the way the Q feature is satisfied is that it attracts T. And so we're going to do that by grabbing T, which is going to prevent this lowering. So we'll notice that the morphology changes on eat. We're going to get what's known as do support. So do is going to fly in. It's going to match the tense of the T. So this is going to become does. And then raise to here. So does Celicum eat almonds? Pretty straightforward. Then the final, so to make this a content question, the main thing we have to change is, again, adding a WH feature to that complementizer position to attract the WH feature of the WH element that's going to be moved, and then, of course, having a WH element to move. So we would change almonds, and again, I'll make this new color to, you can tell I'm very excited about my markers. We'll change almonds to what? That would have a WH feature. So that's going to be marked plus WH. And then we're going to add plus WH up here. And we're simply just going to move that here again. And so you can see that all of these structures just build off of each other. So we have examples of head movement, and a bar movement to get our to get our content question. And this looks very sloppy. I can see that, and I apologize for that. It's partially because of the way I did this tree. But you can see the sort of the way in which the structures sort of build off of each other. And so last time we also saw some constraints on a bar movement. And I want to talk about a few more of these constraints today. So one of the constraints that we saw was that WH movement needs to happen in cycles. That if you have multiple complementizer phrases, you're going to move into an intermediate complementizer phrase, even though it's the highest complementizer phrase. That is perhaps the attractor. So we saw that with what did... Hi, chicken. This is the cat again. We saw this in what did... ow, stop biting me. We saw this in what did Mary say John can eat, for instance, where that what is the object of the embedded clause, and it's going to move cyclically, stopping in the embedded CP and then raise into the specifier of the highest C. And if that embedded C is filled with something else, it can't stop. And we saw that last time. So I want to talk about some other movement constraints today. Most of these movement constraints come from work by a linguist, John Ross. Did absolutely brilliant work. We refer to a lot of these as islands. And a lot of the work we're going to try to do is come up with explanation as to why these islands exist. And the cat is really active today, so we're probably going to get some more visitation. That's all right. There he is, messing with the camera. All right, he's taking a lay down next to us. Okay, so one of the... Stop attacking the camera. Now you can see my laundry hanging up. Stop, dude. I apologize for this. Okay, so one of the things that we know, one of the types of constraints on movement that exist are coordinate constraints. So movement out of coordinate structures. I haven't really talked about coordinate structures. We're not really going to deal with a structure of coordinate structures because, frankly, they're really, really hard. It's really unclear. Even now, I'm not really sure what a good analysis of a coordinate structure looks like. But we know that you can't move just out of one side of a coordinate structure. So I'll give you some examples of this. So we can't say, for instance, Selicum can eat bananas and almonds. And we can obviously say this. I'm going to spell it. So I want to give you the good version of the sentence first. So that's a good sentence. But we can't say either what can eat and bananas and almonds. Or sorry, what can Selicum erase this. What can Selicum eat? And almonds, where we're trying to extract bananas, or what, where in the position where bananas was. Nor can we say what can Selicum eat bananas and this might seem trivially true because they're so obviously ungrammatical, but it's interesting that they're ungrammatical. So it's showing us that you can't extract one side of a conjunct. And the animals are very active today. But you can't extract one side of a conjunct. You have to extract the full conjunct. The conjunct forms what's known as an island. So what we're going to use this for is not necessarily to explore WH words right now. We're going to actually explore a different aspect and show that WH type movement effects exist even when we don't see them. And so that's where I'm going to say we're going to do some baby semantics. So I want to look at a couple of sentences that are, and talk a little bit about some sort of semantic effects. So if you've taken semantics or are familiar with some basic semantics, this is great. If not, it's going to be really, really low-level semantics. So we're going to talk about ambiguity, and we've talked about ambiguity before, but this is going to be a new type of ambiguity. So the sentence I'm going to look at first is a flag flies in front of every bank. Now, this sentence is ambiguous. There is a sort of rational reading of this sentence and an irrational reading of this sentence. Now, the rational reading of this sentence is that there is that every bank has a flag in front of it, like has a different flag. I mean, it might be the same version of a flag, but it's not the same individual flag. There is a irrational version of this sentence, which says, there is one giant flag that drapes in front of every bank in the world. How do we, when we look at the sort of scope of these two, what we're going to call quantifiers, we can see that they behave, we can get this ambiguity out of this. So we're going to talk about what is known as the existential quantifier, some x, such that x is a flag. I'm not going to worry about all of this, versus every y. This is the irrational reading, which is there is some x, there's some flag, and it's in front of every bank, versus every y, there is some flag. Okay, well, that's interesting. And maybe this is just some sort of weird semantic effect, and we don't really have to worry about it. So I want to make an argument that, in fact, these types of quantifiers, these are actually subject to the same types of movement constraints that we saw with our WH movement. And I'm going to make that argument based on the type of coordinate constraint that we just saw. So I'm going to change our example a little bit, but the critical thing is that so this some quantifier corresponds with here, and the every quantifier corresponds with this all corresponds with every. So I'm going to change our example a little bit here. And the idea, so we're going to have the sentence, some critic reviewed every movie. Now this sentence has the same ambiguity as our previous sentence in the same way. But it's a little bit more rational, especially if we limit our universe, if we limit the universe of movies. Like, obviously, it's not going to be the case that some critic has reviewed every single movie that has ever existed. That's not possible. But, you know, if we limit the universe to every movie currently out in theaters, that certainly is a reasonable interpretation. And, you know, we always have a sort of contextual interpretation in mind whenever we interpret a sentence. So some critic reviewed every movie. It's certainly possible to get the some reading in what we refer to as wide scope. But it's also perfectly reasonable for this sentence to have the other interpretation, wherein all that we really care about is that there is a match between movies and critics. I'm really bad. One, movie theaters aren't even open right now, so I don't even know what movies are available, so I'm just going to make up some movies. We'll say the movies in our universe are Tootsie, The Avengers, Star Wars, I need one more movie. Let's say Troll 2. Those are the 4 movies that exist in this universe. And our critics are Hadass, Selicum, and Heidi. So in one interpretation of this, the some critic interpretation, Hadass reviewed every movie. That's a perfectly reasonable interpretation of this sentence. That's this interpretation. In another interpretation of this, Hadass reviewed Tootsie and reviewed Star Wars. Selicum reviewed Troll 2. Heidi reviewed The Avengers and reviewed Tootsie. Every movie has been reviewed by some critic, but no critic reviewed every single movie. But this interpretation is satisfied, and the sentence is also true. So, and we would evaluate the sentence as true, given that interpretation. So what we might say is that, well, this is, how do we get this interpretation? Well, one idea is that this, either all of this DP, this quantifier phrase, is moving, but moving at a later point in the derivation, after pronunciation. Well, do we have any evidence for something like that? And I'm going to argue yes, in fact we do. Let's go back to our argument for based on coordination. Let's take the same sentence we had before. Some critic reviewed every movie. But let's add a coordinate structure to this. And bought a sweater. Well, we know that you cannot extract WH elements, or you can't a bar move out of a coordinate structure. So if this type of quantifier movement is the same type of movement that we have with WH movement, we would expect that that second reading is unavailable in this type of structure, and that's exactly what happens. Some critic reviewed every movie and bought a sweater must mean the Hadass reviewed every movie reading. It cannot mean the there's just a match between movies and critics, but no single critic reviewed every movie. So this tells us something really interesting about the model of language, the model of grammar that we're building. And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier with this notion of the relationship between syntax and semantics. That semantics is the output of syntax. And so what we're going to build from this is a grammatical model. And the model that we're really building is a little bit dated, I will warn you. But it's still a useful pedagogical tool. But this is roughly the what we might refer to as the GB era model of syntax. Those of you that are maybe more familiar with more minimalist approaches are going to notice that some of this is dated and has been removed from the model. And I'll do a video at the very end that talks about transitioning to this. But I do think it's useful to talk about the GB era model of syntax. So this is what's known as the T model, and it is differentiated from the Y model, but they're very similar in a lot of ways. And the cat is really just going crazy right now. So we have what's known as deep structure. And at deep structure, we build our structures. This is where we compute our X bar rules. This is where we check our theta criteria. So we build our syntactic structure and we check our theta criteria. We then apply movement operations and we go to what's known as surface structure. So here we apply movement operations that we've seen. So we apply things like WH movement and A movement and head movement and so forth. At surface structure, you can roughly think about this as what is the pronounced form, though this over here is what's known as phonetic or phonological form. We haven't really talked much about this, but really the surface structure is more or less the pronounced form. And really the key point that I want to talk about today is the difference between surface structure and what's known as LF or logical form. And that's what we were seeing with those quantifiers, is that there is an interaction between, we can have a bar movement occurring at between deep structure and surface structure in English, for instance, where we move we move question words overtly, but then we can have what is known as covert movements, wherein the same types of A-bar principles apply, but they apply at a level between surface structure and LF. So we don't actually see them in the pronounced form, but they still have an effect on interpretation. And so in our next video, I will talk about those with respect to question words themselves, and we'll look at some cross-linguistic data to do that. So I will close the video here. And like always, I want to close with some sort of piece of culture that I think might be of use in this sort of trying time. And this is Farm by Hermann Hesse. When I see this blessed countryside again at the southern foothills of the Alps, then I will always feel as if I were coming home from banishment, as if I were once again on the right side of the mountains. Here the sun shines more intimately, the mountains glow with a deeper red. Here the chestnuts and the grapes, almonds and figs are growing. The human beings are good, civilized and friendly, even though they are poor. And everything they fashion seems so good, so precise and so friendly, as if it were grown by nature itself. The houses, the walls, the steps up into the vineyards, the paths, the new plantings, and the terraces. Everything is neither new nor old. Everything appears as if it were not merely contrived, imitated from nature, but had simply risen as fields do, and trees and moss. The walls of the vineyards, the houses and the roofs of houses, they are all made of the same brown stone, and they still look like one another. They are like brothers. Nothing seems alien, hostile, or violent. Everything appears warm, serene, neighborly. Sit down anywhere you like, on a wall, a stone, a tree stump, on the grass, or the earth. Anywhere they surround you, a painting and a poem. Everywhere the world resonates beautifully and happily around you. This is a farm where poor workers make their home. They have no cows, only pigs, goats, and chickens. They plant grapes, corn, fruit, and vegetables. The whole house is built of stone, even the floors and the stairs. A hewn stairway leads between two stone pillars into the courtyard. Everywhere the lake gleams blue between the growing things and stone. Thoughts and sorrows seem to have remained on the other side of the mountain. Between tormented men and hateful deeds, a person has to think and sorrow so much. Back there it is so difficult and so desperately important to find a reason for staying alive. How else should a person go on living? Sheer misery makes one profound. But here there are no problems. Mere existence needs no justification. Thinking becomes a game. A person discovers the world is beautiful and life is brief. Some longings remain unsatisfied. I would like to have another pair of eyes, another lung. I stretch out my legs in the grass, and I wish they could be longer. I wish I could be a giant. I wish I could lie with my head near the snows on one of the Alps. Lie there among the goats with my toes splashing below in the deep lake. So I would lie there and never get up again. Between my fingers the bushes would grow, and the wild roses of the Alps in my hair. My knees would be alpine foothills, and the vineyards would stand on my body, and the houses and chapels. And there for 10,000 years I would lie there and gaze into the heavens and gaze into the lake. When I would sneeze, there's a thunderstorm. When I would breathe, the snow melts and the waterfalls dance. When I die, the world dies. Then I journey across the world's ocean to bring back a new sun. Where am I going to sleep tonight? Who cares? What is the world doing? Have new gods been discovered? New laws, new freedoms? Who cares? But up here, a primrose is blossoming and bearing silver fuzz on its leaves, and the light, sweet wind is singing me below the poplars. And between my eyes, heaven, a dark golden bee, is hovering and humming. I care about that. It is humming the song of happiness, humming the song of eternity. It is the song, its song is my history of the world.